The PlayStation 2 era was a vibrant time for gaming, marked by experimentation, boundary pushing content, and the expansion of niche genres. Among the more controversial titles that emerged during this period was Backyard Wrestling Don't Try This at Home from 2003 and its sequel, There Goes the Neighborhood from 2004. These games stood out not just for their extreme content, but also for how they reflected a particular cultural movement in the early 2000s. Both games are remembered for their unique blend of fighting mechanics, controversial elements, and a soundtrack that captured the essence of the time. Backyard Wrestling, Don't Try This at Home, and its sequel were developed by Paradox Development, a studio known for its work on various niche titles. The games were published by Eidos Interactive, a company that had already gained reputation for its bold, risk-taking approach with titles like Tomb Raider. The development of the backyard wrestling games was influenced heavily by the real-life backyard wrestling phenomenon, which gained notoriety in the late 90s and early 2000s. Backyard wrestling, as a real-world activity, involved amateur wrestlers, often teenagers, emulating the high-flying, hardcore wrestling style popularized by promotions like ECW and WWE, but without the safety precautions, if any. These impromptu events were often recorded on camcorders and distributed online or via home-burned DVDs, feeding into the growing culture of shock value entertainment that defined a portion of late 90s, early 2000s youth culture. The development team at Paradox sought to capture this raw, unfiltered energy in their games. However, instead of creating a straightforward wrestling simulator akin to WWE games, they opted for a gameplay style more reminiscent of fighting games like Dead or Alive. This decision was likely influenced by the need to differentiate backyard wrestling from the more polished mainstream wrestling games of the time. From the outset, backyard wrestling was mired in controversy. The game's tagline, Don't Try This at Home, was both a warning and an enticement, effectively acknowledging the danger inherent in both the real-life backyard wrestling phenomenon and the virtual one the game presented. Critics and parent groups were quick to decry the games for glorifying violence and encouraging reckless behavior among young players, as they do. The game's marketing, which featured real footage of backyard wrestling stunts gone wrong, only added fuel to the fire. The extreme violence in the games, ranging from using weapons like light tubes and barbed wire to smashing opponents through tables and setting them on fire, was considered excessive even by the standards of the time. While the games carried a mature rating from the ESRB, this did little to quell the concerns of those who believed that backyard wrestling was too provocative and irresponsible, particularly in an era when debates around the impact of video game violence were at their peak. Furthermore, the games faced criticism from within the wrestling community. Hardcore wrestling fans were divided, with some appreciating the games for bringing an underground phenomenon into the mainstream, while others derided them for their unrealistic portrayal of wrestling moves and the lack of respect for the art of professional wrestling. One of the standout features of both backyard wrestling games was their licensed soundtracks. The soundtracks were carefully curated to reflect the rebellious, aggressive spirit of the games and the culture they represented. The music featured a mix of nu metal, rap rock, punk, hardcore, and the like, genres that were particularly popular in the early 2000s. The first game, Don't Try This at Home, featured tracks from artists like Insane Clown Posse, Andrew WK, and CKY, whose music embodied the chaotic energy of the backyard wrestling scene. The Insane Clown Posse's involvement was particularly noteworthy, as the group had a long-standing association with the wrestling world through their promotion Juggalo Championship Wrestling. Backyard Wrestling 2, There Goes the Neighborhood, expanded on this foundation, offering a more diverse soundtrack that included artists such as Sepultura, Mudvayne, and Hoobastank. The music was integral to the overall experience, helping to create a frantic atmosphere that matched the on-screen action. For many players, the soundtrack was one of the most memorable aspects of the games, serving as a time capsule of the musical tastes and trends of the early 2000s. The gameplay of the backyard wrestling games was a significant departure from the simulation-heavy approach of other wrestling games like WWE SmackDown or WrestleMania. Instead, Backyard Wrestling offered a fast-paced, almost arcade-like experience, more in line with fighting games like Dead or Alive or Tekken. The gameplay of the Backyard Wrestling games was a significant departure from the simulation-heavy approach of other wrestling games like WWE SmackDown or even Def Jam. Instead, Backyard Wrestling offered a fast-paced, almost arcade-like experience, more in line with fighting games like Dead or Alive or Tekken. Players could choose from a roster of characters, including real-life backyard wrestlers and hardcore icons like New Jack and the aforementioned Insane Clown Posse. The matches took place in various chaotic environments, ranging from junkyards to strip clubs, where virtually everything in the environment could be used as a weapon. The interactive environments were a significant draw, allowing players to throw their opponents into car windshields, smash them with debris, or toss them off rooftops. The combat system was less about grappling and more about striking, countering, and using the environment to your advantage. This approach gave the game a unique flavour, setting it apart from its wrestling game contemporaries. However, this focused on fast-paced, high-impact action also led to some criticism. Fans of traditional wrestling games found the lack of depth in the wrestling mechanics disappointing, with many lamenting the absence of realistic moves and the general lack of polish in the controls. The backyard wrestling games are very much a product of their time, reflecting the cultural and social currents of the early 2000s. This was a period marked by a fascination with extreme sports, reality TV, and a general blurring of the lines between entertainment and real-life violence. Shows like Jackass and events like the X Games captured the attention of young audiences who were drawn to the thrill of watching and sometimes participating in dangerous stunts. Backyard wrestling tapped into this zeitgeist, offering players a chance to engage in over-the-top violence in a virtual playground where consequences were non-existent. The game's emphasis on shock value and extreme content was very much in line with the broader entertainment landscape of the time, which was increasingly dominated by media that pushed boundaries and challenged conventional notions of taste. Moreover, the game's soundtracks, character designs, and overall aesthetic were emblematic of the early 2000s, a time when nu metal and rap rock were at the height of their popularity, and rebellious anti-establishment attitudes were pervasive among youth culture. The gritty DIY ethos of the backyard wrestling scene mirrored the attitudes of a generation that was increasingly disillusioned with traditional forms of authority and eager to carve out its own identity. Backyard Wrestling, Don't Try This at Home, and Backyard Wrestling 2, There Goes the Neighborhood, remain some of the most controversial and unique wrestling games ever made. While they may not have achieved the same level of critical acclaim or commercial success as other wrestling or fighting games, they left an indelible mark on the gaming landscape. The game's development, controversies, licensed soundtracks, and gameplay all contribute to their legacy as products of a very specific cultural movement. Today they are remembered as relics of a time when gaming was unafraid to court controversy and push the boundaries of what was considered acceptable content.